back 10 years to just down the road to the London School of Economics, when the Queen turned up in the depth of the Great Depression, or the Great Recession, sorry, in the summer of 2009, almost exactly 10 years ago, and she stepped out of her limousine in front of the various obsequious academics who were greeting at the door, and the first thing she said is, "Why did no one see this coming?" That's the first question she said to them before they'd even opened their mouths. This, of course, threw them back somewhat. They were expecting a much more amenable Queen, but obviously the Queen was feeling the effects of the Great Depression just as much as we were at that point, and wanted to know why this had happened. So 3 days later, the very prestigious British Academy of Scientists, including economists, sent her a letter, a formal letter which was published. And I'll just read you a short paragraph which is up here. "Your Majesty, the failure to foresee the time and extent of severity of the crisis and to head it off, while it had many causes, was principally a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people, both in this country and internationally, to understand the risks to the system as a whole." In other words, if we want to take out all that and just say we don't know why it happened, we have no idea why it happened, we're bright people, but we didn't know why it happened. Now, there's been a number of official explanations since then, in that period. On the left-hand side, before we got to the crisis, we were being told by mainstream economics that no crisis was possible at all. Robert Lucas, who is a Nobel Prize winner, said that the central problem of depression prevention has been solved, he said in 2003. Olivier Blanchard, who became the chief economist at the IMF and is a very important mainstream economist, said the state of macroeconomics is good, as he said in 2008, as the whole world plummeted down a drain. So the question then asked by October 2008 to the then financial maestro of the US economy, Alan Greenspan, who was the Federal Reserve chair at the time, he was giving evidence to the US Congress in the middle of this terrible slump, and he said the following when he was questioned: "I'm in a state of shocked disbelief. In other words," said the House chair, "you found your view of the world was not right. It was not working." Absolutely, precisely. You know, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was all working exceptionally well. A little bit later, he was brought back to Congress to say, well, you can't predict crises, it's impossible, and we just have to recognise they happen every so often. During the crisis, Greenspan then went on to say, this disaster was a 1 in a million chance, he said. It was a massive natural force, and it constituted a perfect storm. Hank Paulson, anybody remember him? He was the head of Goldman Sachs, who Bush piled into the government to become Treasury Secretary to hand out trillions of dollars to the banks to save them. He was asked what was the cause of the crisis, and he said, this sort of thing happens only once or twice in 100 years. Economist Daniel Gross commented on this chance explanation, what's the difference between once or twice? Just $7 trillion. If I, oops, have I jumped one? Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at this one. Perhaps I can't see plus and minus. Where we go? Ah, there we are. Yeah, okay. On the right-hand side, I just want you to, if you can see that writing, is the words of Eugene Fama, another Nobel Prize winner, who has won the Nobel Prize, by the way, for saying that market economies work absolutely efficiently as long as everybody knows what's going on. There is no possibility of a breakdown in a market economy if it's efficient and people have full information. And he was asked about the crisis. He said, we don't know what causes recessions. I'm not a macroeconomist, so I don't feel particularly bad about that. We've never known. Debates go on to this day what caused the Great Depression. Economics is not very good at explaining swings in economic activity. If I could have predicted the crisis, I would have. I don't see it. I'd love to know more about what causes business cycles. Now, these people are Nobel Prize winners in economics. So they're not idiots, are they? But it seems that mainstream economics did not have an understanding of what happened in 2008-9, or really what happens in any crises whatsoever. And so that leads us to consider if we can go a little bit deeper than just looking at the outside of things. Again, I'm struggling. There we go. Now, Ben Bernanke was the Fed chairman at the time of the crisis, and back in 2001, about 2008, he said, look, it's very difficult to understand what's going on in a financial panic. Each one has its own unique features, but we must strip away the unique features. We've got to look at the common elements, identify and isolate the common factors of crisis, thereby enabling us to prevent crises when possible and to respond effectively when not. I couldn't agree more. You can't solve anything if you're a doctor unless you know what the cause of the illness is. It's no good just looking at the symptoms and trying to ameliorate them. You can do that if you want to have your Lemsip, but it's not going to get rid of the cold unless we can see what's going on with the virus. So he's making a very good point. Each crisis is different. Whatever kicks it off could be different, but then we need to look for a common element in this process, and that's exactly what I think we should be doing, and that's what Marxism provides us with. So crises are not random shocks. In the case of crises, every slump may appear to have a different cause, like 1929 was due to a stock market collapse. So we're told 74-75 global slump, which a few of you may have been around at the time, I was apparently triggered by an oil price hike. And of course, what we've just seen in the 21st century capitalist crisis, the biggest of all since the 30s, was caused by a property crash in the US and followed by all the credit derivatives based on that property market also going down. And yet, crises happen on a regular and repeated basis. So we need to look to see what causes causes of crisis, because there must be some. They can't just be random events or shocks if they recur on a regular and recurring basis. So, before I get to Keynes, I'd just like to mention Robert Solow. I'm going to do a lot of economists here because I love having a go at mainstream economists, but Robert Solow is an excellent 85-year-old economist who made the point that macroeconomics that dominates serious thinking in our elite universities and in many central banks and everywhere seems to have absolutely nothing to say about crises. Not only does it offer no guidance or insight, it seems really have nothing useful to say. He singles out neoclassical economics with its idea of a perfect market as nothing useful to say about what to do about crises, even if you know they are there. And that's, again, another Nobel Prize winner who comments, who is supposedly a neoclassical economist who considers that neoclassical economics has failed miserably. So we must move on. Now, the alternative is often presented is the idea that comes from Keynes and the Keynesian theory in the spectrum of economics. Now, the Keynesians argue, yes, there is a problem, and yes, it will happen. There are crises in capitalism. They can't be ignored. They can't be considered 1 in a million chance. They will occur. To use the phrase that Paul Krugman uses, referring to Keynes, Keynes says that crises, or like the Great Depression of the 1930s, which was the 20th century capitalist crisis, if you like, famously declared that capitalism can have magneto trouble. The economy's troubles were like those of a car with a small but critical problem in its electrical system. And the job of the economist is to figure out what that little problem is in the magneto, repair it. Just a technical problem. He actually went on to say, economists are a bit like dentists. If you get a toothache, we sort out the tooth and then off everything goes again. So this is the argument, the fundamental view of the Keynesians, who say that it's really a technical malfunction. What is that malfunction? Well, I'm jumping a little. Krugman says it's a bit like there's a huge loss of effective demand. Suddenly people don't spend, suddenly people don't invest. So you guys stop spending, you don't go to the shops, you don't buy as much as you did before. Obviously you buy something, otherwise you'd starve. And companies stop investing and employing as much people as they were before. So there's a huge loss of demand, both in consumption and investment. So why does this loss of demand take place? Well, Krugman gives us an example of a baby cooperative. He said, you've got 150 couples who agree to babysit for each other. And what they do is they form a co-op and they give each other 20 vouchers, which give them the right to get 1.5 hours of babysitting from the others. So you get babysitting, they hand over a voucher, that person comes and babysits for you, and so the process is supposed to go around. It's a cooperative using money to circulate around to find the babysitting. Well, Krugman says what happens under capitalism sometimes is that people don't spend their vouchers to get babysitting. Whatever reason, maybe they decide to hold them because they want to have a whole night off rather than half an hour. So they build up all their coupons waiting to do that. That means that lots of people who want to babysit so they can get coupons can't babysit because nobody wants to give them the coupons. So hoarding goes on. Well, this is nothing. So that is the theory, one of the theories that Krugman puts forward for the collapse in demand. For some unaccountable, subjective reason, a load of people decide not to use the sitting system and buy babysitting time with their coupons. Why? Well, they don't feel like it. This is the subjective argument that's being presented by the Keynesians. Marx said, of course, yes, of course, there'll be situations in slumps where people do hoard money, where capitalists hoard money. They don't want to spend it because they may not receive the return that they do if they spend it on investment. And people don't want to spend it because they're worried about not having enough money to survive. But that situation of hoarding and holding back money takes place once the crisis has begun. The argument of the Keynesians is it's the cause of the crisis. But is that convincing? Is that really a convincing argument that a recession, to call what Krugman says, is a problem of inadequate demand? There isn't enough demand to provide jobs for everyone who wants one. Well, so if this is the reason, if it's a collapse in consumption, because this has now become a modern theory where we say workers their wages have been held down, inequality has grown, they take out mortgages and they raise their debt, but when that collapses, then the fact that they haven't got enough money to spend, and because they've got huge debts, causes a collapse in consumption. Well, is consumption the cause of a slump? Well, this is my attempt to measure in the US the change in consumption 1 year before each slump. So if you take the blue dot, that's personal consumption. That's the spending by you guys in households in America 1 year before the slump. In 53 it falls a tiny bit. In 57 it falls a bit more. In 74 it doesn't really fall at all. In 1982 it actually rises 1 year before the slump. And in the last two there's a little bit of a fall. GDP is the orange one, so that's the total output that's falling. That falls in every year before the slump, but only a little more than the consumption, but not as much as the grey blocks, which is business investment. Business investment is what falls 1 year before a slump in a big way. And look at the Great Recession, it fell 30% 1 year before the GDP slump really got into, and we had the Great Recession. And actually consumption was hardly falling. Consumption in the US as a percentage of GDP, household consumption, was about 70% before the slump. It was still rising on the whole, except for the one last year. It was very, very high. The so-called debt hadn't really destroyed the consumer process. So consumption is not a very convincing argument for what causes a crisis. Investment is the swing factor as far as I'm concerned, and I think originally Keynes would say as well. And this is a bit much. If you can follow this very quickly, you can't really fit quickly, but we're going to try. On the left-hand side is what we call the Keynesian macro identities. This is what the Keynesian macroeconomists spend all their time in universities going up and down with this. What's the macro identity? Well, it says the total national income, all the income that we earn, that's everybody in this room, and the total spending, how much you're spending, will equal each other. Let's assume that they do. They equal each other. If we break it down, the income must be the wages that you guys get and the profits the capitalists get. So you just have two forms of income, what profits and wages. On the other side, we've got investing in employment, investment by the capitalists, and you spending your money in the shops and on your health service and so on. So profit plus wages equals investment plus consumption. So the equality is still there. Now, if we assume that all you guys don't save anything, you just can't save anything, just assume that. You just spend everything you've got because there's nothing, no leeway. And so all the wages are saved. So there's no spending because so we can take out wages and we can take out consumption in that equation. And what do we end up with? Profits equals investment. Okay? Now, Keynes says nothing can restore profits that does not first restore the volume of investment. So the Keynesian view is the profits are created by investment. If the capitalists must invest in order to get, and then they will get profits. This is not a very realistic way of considering it. Don't you think in a profit-making capitalist economy where capitalists go out to invest and produce for money to make a profit, that they first want to feel that they're going to get a profit and that they have profits also to invest? So Minsky, one of the Keynesians, says it's investment that calls the tune. Workers spend what they earn, yes, and capitalists earn what they spend. So capitalists get their profit because they invest. Workers spend what they earn. That's the Keynesian view. Well, I think that's back to front. Profits depend on investment, say the Keynesians. No. Investment depends on profit, says the Marxist view. That's the difference. The equality is the same. Profits equal investment. But as you know, equalities don't tell you which way round is the cause. And so you have to make a decision about that. And profit depends on the exploitation of labour power. Profit is created by the exploitation of the working class. Capitalists putting workers to work to produce goods which they sell for more than they pay the workers in wages, and that profit is appropriated by the capitalist. So Marx says there's an objective causal analysis which leads from profit to capitalists. Keynes says that the crisis is due to some sort of individual behaviour. Suddenly they stop buying babysitting with their coupons. And in fact, investment must take place before profits are made. So this is the difference, the key difference in my view, of all the views of mainstream economics. All of them, one thing they all agree on, they don't agree much else maybe, they agree that there's nothing to do with profit. Crises are nothing to do with profit. So we live in a profit-making capitalist economy where businesses only produce and invest if they can make a profit, but according to them, profit has nothing to do with the crisis. You can rule it out altogether. Businesses in money-making machines, but really what's more important apparently is effective demand, as I've just described it, or maybe a chance in a million, or lack of consumer spending. But nothing, don't tell me about profit, that implies some sort of exploitation process going on, which I don't really want to hear about. So this brings me to Marx's view and also to us trying to understand the common element in recurring and regular crises. Marx's law of profitability, the most important law in political economy according to Marx, historically and logically as well, was a tendency for the rate of profit on capital to fall over time, a tendency. The crisis of 2008-9 has an underlying cause based on the contradiction between capitalists trying to accumulate more, competing with each other to get more profit, and as a result, a tendency of the rate of profit to fall as a result of that process. There's a contradiction between trying to produce more, invest more, and the ability to sustain the profitability of that investment. That's the key contradiction. We'll briefly explain why it's a contradiction. The contradiction arises because capitalist production is for value, not for use. The aim is for profit, not production for consumption. So there's an underlying contradiction which only can be resolved if capitalism can wipe out this contradiction by a slump. And Marx said it was a tendency. I've just been criticised recently by an academic who said, you said it was a law of profitability, but sure it's the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Well, yes, I was just being shorthand, but you know, people are nitpicking, never mind. Law as such is a law of the tendency. So there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall over a long time. This tendency will overcome counteracting factors, but there are counteracting factors. These are the some of them that Marx raised. First of all, if capitalists are putting workers more and more to work, exploiting them as hard as they can, using machinery to get more production out of them, then there's a tendency for the rate of profit or surplus value out of the workers to increase. So on the one hand, the capitalists are competing with each other to get more of the share of the market. By doing so, they increase the amount they invest in machinery and technology. They reduce the amount relatively that they invest in labour. That causes profitability to start to fall. But if they can exploit the workers that they do have even more, then they can perhaps counteract that. And they can get higher profits from overseas. That's what imperialism is all about, exploiting people with lower wages, lower conditions, who need a job badly, and to use that through trade, investment and other methods to get more profits. But obviously that's just national profits. If the whole world is involved in this process of capitalist development, then that one falls. And also new technology. If I introduce a computer and then another computer which is way cheaper, then I've reduced the cost of my ability to increase the productivity of labour. So that's a factor which acts as a counteracting factor against the profitability falling. But as Marx explained, over a period of time, and these counteracting factors, as I say, did operate from 82 to about the end of the 20th century. Over a period of time, those counteracting factors will not be sufficient to overcome the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. How can I say that? Well, as I say, the profit is offset, but these factors, the economic crisis can create conditions for that, restoring that profitability. The fundamental issue is the insufficient production of surplus value, not its distribution as such. And here is a measure of the world rate of profit to try and prove the argument of Marx. This is in the book called The World Crisis, which I have here, edited by myself and Mino Carcadi, an Italian Marxist economist. And this is out of a chapter by Esteban Maito, an Argentine Marxist economist. Esteban Maito works for the Argentine Treasury, God help him. Apparently, he tells me, he has a basement office with no light, where he works during the day on trying to solve Argentine's debt problem. And then in the night, he does this sort of thing. So he measured 14 different countries' rate of profit. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of how you get the rate of profit. If you want to, you can ask me. There are lots of papers on it. But all I can say is everybody disagrees how to measure it, but we do the best we can. And here is a measure of rate of profit since 1869 for 14 countries. So that's the sort of best we can do for a world rate of profit. And what do you see? That the tendency of the rate of profit is actually achieved. There is a fall in the rate of profit, but not in a straight line. There are periods when, from 1869 to 93, the long depression of the 19th century, there's quite a sharp fall. Then there's a recovery towards the end of the 19th century, and then the First World War, you see quite a high rate of profit. Then during the interwar period, it drops sharply until the war begins again in the late 30s, and the rate of profit rises to a new height in the Second World War. And then in this, what we call the golden age now, the period that I was happy to be a young man in, where we had much better life than you lot, the rate of profit, and the reason is because the rate of profit was relatively high and capitalists could concede things to a strong labour movement, which they were unable to do once the profitability crisis set in 65 to 83, and there's a big crash in the rate of profit. That was the period which led to a complete reversal of the so-called social democratic policies of the labour movement and the government working together with business, blah, blah, blah. Business no longer could afford a social democratic government and could no longer afford a welfare state, could no longer afford a strong trade unions. They had to be stopped. Privatisation, strong trade unions, and the slump of 1980-82 set the conditions for wiping that out, and what was called is called by the academics the neoliberal period. I've never quite understood why, but never mind, doesn't matter, the academics call it. By the way, I'm not an academic, I'm a professional economist. Of the 4 people speaking in these lectures, I'm the only one who's not an academic. I used to work for loads of banks, so I come from a different angle. And in that neoliberal period, we see a recovery in the rate of profit, but not very much, a little bit. And so we enter the period of the 21st century, which we're talking about here, and you see that the rate of profit on the world scale, on an average, for 14 countries, on an average, it's never been lower. It's way lower. You may want to ask the question, is it going to zero? We can discuss that later. But you can see that it's never been low. So Marx's law of profitability over the long term appears to operate. It appears to be correct. It cannot be dismissed. The evidence is combined with the theory. And that's where it's found. You can get more details on that there. Is it just a long-term theory? No. I think it's both a secular theory, which we've seen it takes over a long time, but also a cyclical one. There are periods when the rate of profit falls that it causes actually a total fall in profits in total, not just the profit per investment, but the total profit in absolute terms starts to fall. And that's when you get slumps. So if you can see when the slumps come on a regular basis, when the rate of profit turns into an absolute fall in the mass of profit. And the only way that you can transform that position and take it forward under capitalism is to wipe out all the costs which are driving down the profitability, which means laying off lots of workers, because that saves money, closing down old factories, merging rotten companies like Thomas Cook, wiping them out, replacing them with something that's online, changing the situation of the nature of industry so that you can create the conditions for whoever's left to have a higher rate of profit. And that is what that's the nature of this regular process. So I have a little diagram here to show how regular it is. You start at the top, so we've got a boom going on, it's all going fine, never been better, macro is good, then the rate of profit starts to fall, eventually it leads to a fall in the mass of profit, and there's a production crisis and an investment crisis. Collapse in investment, which we saw, takes place. This leads to the collapse in consumption and employment and the lack of effective demand. So the lack of effective demand comes as a result of the collapse in profits and the collapse in investment, not the other way around, which is the Keynesian view. So once you've got then you can, if that situation is going on in your productive sectors of the economy, if there's a big stock market boom going on and a housing boom going on, then that's going to come crashing down because the returns on all these financial investments, which turn out to be fictitious, as Marx called it, fictitious capital. It's a claim on what might happen, but it doesn't appear, and there's a collapse. So everything goes down, you clear off all the dead wood, and you enter a period where whoever's left has a higher rate of profit, so everything starts going up again, and both we can go back to booming stock markets and all the rest of it. So we go around in a cycle like this. How long does that cycle take? Well, it can vary in every country and in different periods. At the moment, well, I'll come on to discuss, it seems in 21st century it's taking a little longer than we thought before. Now, is there a correlation then between what happens with profit and what happens with investment? Here is measurement by an Australian Marxist economist called Peter Jones. He says the blue line is the rate of investment in the US. So you can see back in 1960s it was growing at about 16% a year, and the profit being achieved was pretty much huge. Well, so the rate of combination is 14, the profit was rising at 16, sorry, the other way around, so the orange line. But you can see how close it is. So if profits come down, which is the orange line, then the blue line, investment growth, also comes down. And I and others have done research to show, well, you might say, well, which way is it? Which causes which? Well, we can show very clearly that profits lead the investment process downwards by about a year. There's a lag. So if profits are falling, you could expect within a year, it will take the empirical evidence, a fall in the rate of investment. If profits actually go negative, to some extent you will probably see a negative fall in investment, then you'll have a slump. So the correlation between profit and investment is strong, and the direction is from profit to investment. I want to emphasize this because in a Marxist memorial library with a Marxist economist, we would have to say that capitalism is a system for production for profit. So we're looking to understand what is happening to profit, to understand whether capitalism can deliver anything or whether it's going to go into slump. The mainstream economists want to go and talk about effective demand or baby cops. I want to talk about what is happening in the real nature of the capitalist economy. And that's a key correlation for us to consider when we're considering what's going on. And I say that because the modern theory, which has appeared in the 21st century, is it's, again, not really to do with the profitability of capital. It's to do with financialization. What has happened in the last 20 or 30 years is that the finance sector has become huge. It's taken over the whole running of the capitalist economy, and its aim is for speculation on the stock market, on the bond market, controlling things in order to extract a bit of interest and profit and capital and banking fees. Now, in my view, well, there's nothing unusual about that. That's always been the case for the finance sector. What is the purpose of the finance sector under capitalism? It is to create the conditions by which this capitalism can move its money and its capital, money capital in particular, around more efficiently. Because if you're an industrial capitalist and you want to raise some money and you need to build, I don't know, a massive great power plant, that's going to take you 10 years. You may not have the profits for that. You can't hoard the profits for 10 years. You can try, but what you can do is you can go to a bank and get a loan, or you can issue a bond and people will buy it so that you can build that power factory. What's happening then is that the finance sector is collating all the available unused money to help to get that loan for you as an industrialist so that you can invest. So that's, in a way, the progressive role of credit and banking. But of course, it's taken on a power of its own in order to create and speculate. Why has suddenly finance sprouted into this great monster that was brought about the Great Recession as well, and the financial and global crash and all those banks? Now, the argument of the financialization thesis is because capitalism has changed. Now the banks and the finance sector rules, so that Amazon and Microsoft are actually banks. That's one argument. Or Amazon and Microsoft are actually ruled by the big banks. Well, I don't think that's very convincing to me. I think there's quite a lot of connection between the two, but it seems to me that the reason finance has become big in the last 30 years is because the profitability of the productive sector has stayed down. And we can show evidence to show that from the point of view of an industrialist, investing in a new power plant or a new factory, wherever it is around the world, is increasingly more expensive relative to the return they can get on it. So maybe you should just play the market. And you can find a bit of money there, and everybody will buy each other's shares and drive everything up in a fictitious way, and you can make profit. But that comes crashing down because the productive sector is still the key force in a society. Here is a measure by Mino Carcadi, also in that book, where he looks at whether financial crashes, he measures that by the fall in financial profits, are correlated with falls in the actual profits in the productive sector amongst the industrialists and producers. Well, he finds that unless there's a fall in real profits, all these financial crashes, if there is a fall in the real profits, then the fall in the financial profits, in other words financial crashes, will correlate with a slump. So the slumps come about when real profits fall and then you get a financial crash. But there are many occasions, well, several occasions, where there's a fall in financial profits, a collapse in the stock market, and there is no slump. That's because the productive sector hasn't got a fall. So the grey line is still up. So you could have a fall in financial profits, but if the grey lines are up, then there won't be a recession. When they correlate, which they do exactly for all these crises in the 20th century and into the 21st century, then you can get that correlation. That means that the productive sector is really driving what is going on. So let me just sum up what the Marxist, in my view, the Marxist theory of crises is at present in relation to all these alternatives, or at least as I've sketched them out. By the way, you will probably find that Costas will completely disagree with this. Simon Mohan may disagree with the figures, and John Weeks says it isn't really a crisis. So I don't know. I'll let you work that out later on if you go to all the lectures. But so this is my version. So let's sum it up. What are the causes of booms and slumps, recessions and depressions? The dominant classical view, neoclassical view, is it's due to failures in frictions in the marketplace or just random events where efficient markets are no longer efficient. The Keynesians say it's due to a lack of effective demand, which happens by chance or by irrational behavior on the part of individuals or companies who suddenly hoard money rather than spend it, and this can lead to a liquidity trap a hoarding of money which isn't available, driving interest rates. There's a version of that called the post-Keynesian or Minsky school, which says there's an inherent instability in the finance. This financialization is now out of control, it's causing instability and excessive risk-taking, and that this is causing the continual crisis from the finance sector. There's a right-wing Austrian school that says the reason for the financial instability is because governments and central banks interfere in finance. Just let finance do what it likes and everything will be absolutely fine. Stop, deregulate finance. The Keynesians say regulate finance. Marxists say take over finance, which is a little bit different, isn't it? And finally, so we're saying that Marxism crises and slumps are not caused by effective demand or excessive debt or financial instability, but by falling and low profitability in production investment. And the impact of a falling profitability can be postponed by credit and this fictitious capital process, but eventually the slump will be exacerbated by that and then will happen. So excessive debt is very important. As I say, other Marxists may have a different view about this. But let me just go into an important point I want to present here, which is the 21st century version of capitalism as I see it, particularly in the last 10 years. Now, in my book, The Long Depression, written in 2016, I have this little schematic diagram, and on the top left-hand corner is the nature of a recession. Recession, you're going along nicely at 3% a year, then there's a slump, you come back up and we start all over again. So it's a V shape. 1974-5 was typical of that. Then you could even have a W. You could have a double dip like in 1980, goes down, comes back up again, goes down, eventually it goes back to trend. But a depression is when you go down and then you don't actually ever get back to the trend growth. I think there have been 3 depressions in the history of modern industrial capitalism up to now. The late 19th century depression, and that little squiggly line is more or less accurate about what happened during that period. It's dived in 1873, recovered a bit, but never got back to trend growth. Then in the Great Depression of 1930s, huge crash, 29 to 32, the terrible Great Depression as it's called, a recovery to 37, then another slump. Didn't get out of it. And only the war created the conditions for capitalism to get out of that slump. And in my view, the 21st century capitalist crisis is what I call the long depression of the 21st century. So we go down in 2007 to a depth of 2009, we come up to 2012. What's been happening since? Well, that dotted line is still not being reached. And as we speak in the news today, it appears that we are heading further down in most of the economies of Europe, Japan, and now even the US is starting to crack. And they never got back to about a 3% growth. So we've been in what I consider is a long depression. Slow growth, weak investment, and that's because profitability has been low, it's stayed low, and it keeps falling. We've just discussed that before on the law. And also, because what's happened in this particular version, instead of cleansing the system, you might say in the 30s, the Treasury Secretary of the US government, Mellon, said the best thing to do is to liquidate everything, get all the rubbish out and start again so we can get going. Nobody wants to do that politically, because if you liquidate everything, you could end up having a revolution on your hands. So it's always ameliorated this way. And also this time the capitalists have learnt a bit. They don't want to just wipe out. They didn't want to wipe out every industry. They wanted to save not just the banks, they wanted to save the system and prop it up. They have pumped in trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, not only into the banks, but in also providing cheap loans for industry and everybody. Interest rates now are 0 in most countries, or even negative. I've just heard that in Denmark, for example, if you wanted to borrow some money for a house, they pay you interest. That's what we've got to now. No, it's 5% a year. Oh, 5% a year to me. Oh, thank you very much. I'll have 2 houses. I'll have 3 houses, because that's the situation which, if you think about it, is an absolutely mad situation, because it will mean complete lack of control over whole sectors of speculative parts of the economy, and inability to. And what has that done? It still hasn't driven up the rates of production and investment to new levels. It's still stuck in this what some economists call a secular stagnation. It hasn't got out of this low growth and so on. But it does have a different aspect, that this is the longest expansion in the history of modern capitalism. Wow, that sounds tremendous, doesn't it? Since the slump of 2009, we've had no slump for over 10 years and still going on. That's the longest expansion ever in the history of modern capitalism. So there you go, there's no crisis. But it's the poorest expansion. It's the weakest expansion. Yes, in many major economies people have jobs, but they have rotten jobs, no good jobs. Self-employed jobs, jobs that hardly pay anything, 0 hours jobs, nothing with skills or training, no ability to promote themselves and use their ingenuity and skills to develop, paying really badly. Real wages for the majority of, in the modern major economies, I'm not even talking about the so-called emerging economies or developing economies, but in the modern economies, the G7 economies, the OECD economies, real wages have more or less been stagnant in some countries and hardly risen. Real wages, that's after inflation, in the last 10 years. It's the longest expansion of nothing for the majority of people in this last period. And also for a whole layer of firms and companies, they have not made any profit in this situation. What's happened is they've made just enough money to pay the interest on the huge debts they've been building up to keep going. Thomas Cook was one of those who couldn't manage that. But lots of people are finding very low interest rates. I'm talking about companies now. They've got quite big debts, but they only just earn enough to cover the wages of the workers they're employing and to cover that interest. They're not investing much. They're not improving the company at all. They're just holding in. Now that's become to be called zombie capitalists. So if you can imagine it, these companies go like this because there's nothing, they're not going forward, they're not doing anything, they're just sitting there. And actually they're clogging up the capitalist system. What you need is a good cleanse out. So you can get rid of these companies, get rid of the workers involved in them, get unemployment up, let's get the costs of production and investment down, then profitability will rise and we can start to get the trend growth rate. That's the option. At the moment, capitalism doesn't want to go down that road. It doesn't want to go down what one famous economist, Schumpeter, called creative destruction. It doesn't want to destroy things in order to create them for new, because it's concerned that this time it could actually not create anything at all, but cause a permanent meltdown. And so it's looked for an alternative. And there have been two alternatives. The big one, as I said before, is central banks pumping in loads of money, a big monetary policy. In the 1930s, that was a policy that Keynes advocated. He said, let's cut interest rates, and then let's get the central banks to buy the bonds of the government in order to boost the bank's money, because the banks hold the bond, they buy the bonds from the government, they hold the bonds of the government's bonds, pretty safe bonds, and then the central bank comes along and says, we'll buy the bonds off you, we'll have a load of money for that, and then you can go and lend on to the rest of the economy. So this is what, first we cut interest rates, and then you do that. That's called quantitative easing now. That's spending more money by using the central bank to buy up the bank's bonds in order to boost the level of money available to the banks to lend on. That quantitative easing was actually proposed by Keynes in the 30s. When he got to his famous book, which I don't know if you know, it's called The General Theory, in 1936, he wrote, quantitative easing is not working, it's useless. We're still in a slump. All that's happening is the banks are building up a lot of cash, but they're not handing it to the if they are handing it to the companies don't want it because they don't want to invest. They're worried about their profitability. We haven't cleared out all the zombie companies. They're all still blocking the way. We need to have a proper slump. So Keynes dropped monetary policy. But he only did so towards the end of the 1930s and onwards. And so he saw the other option, which is what we call the fiscal stimulus policy, which is supposedly the Keynesian policy. That means that governments now actually spend money into the economy directly. Governments don't issue bonds and then the central bank buys the bonds. Now government issues bonds, runs up a deficit, so it's spending more than it's getting from its taxes, borrows by issuing bonds, and it uses the difference, this budget deficit, to increase government expenditure, presumably in all kinds of useful things. Keynes said, dig a hole, anything will do to get people employed, or in more useful things like in infrastructure and so on. So fiscal stimulus is the second option within the capitalist system to try and solve this problem. Now, it's very interesting that fiscal stimulus really has not been used in the last 10 years. The Keynesians complain about this. They say, why aren't you spending more money and borrowing? Why all this austerity? Why are you trying to balance the books and get the debt down when everything's in a mess? This is irrational madness. What's wrong with you? It's almost the tone that comes across from the Keynesians. The people running the government are idiots. They're trying to introduce austerity, balance the books. Germany's still trying to balance the books, although it can't help itself, it's making a surplus. But this is wrong. You need to start spending and borrowing. The very modern version of this is what is called modern monetary theory, and these guys say, just spend. And the central bank can issue the money. And then we'll get the economy bouncing forward in a big way. Well, there is a reason, in my view, why that is not happening. And that is not happening because actually government expenditure and investment can interfere with the profitability of the private sector. I don't know if I can show this here. See if I. Well, this is just skipping these buttons. Yes. Well, that's one good one. Did austerity cause the recessions? This is often an argument from Keynesians. It was all holding back, government stopping spending causes the recessions. Well, actually, before every recession, government spending as a percentage of GDP was rising. So what happened after the recession was they cut the spending back because they were in a slump, but not the other way around. Again, it's not the other way around. But the argument of the Keynesians is now you need to spend, you need to boost investment through government spending. Well, if I've got this diagram here, yes, I have. This is a diagram which shows in the US, this is tricky, watch this one, the average real GDP growth as a ratio of either the increase in government spending or either in the increase in profitability. So it's a ratio. So if I increase government spending by 10, how much does growth increase? Does it increase by 10, by 15, by 5? If it increases by 10, matching the increase in government spending, it's a multiplier of 1, to use economic technology. If it increases by 15, it's a multiplier of 1.5, right? So if government spending, which is the red line, increases by 1, how much did growth increase in the period 1971-80 as government spending increased by say 1? 0.3 of 1. So the increase in government spending only got a little bit of increase in growth, if you want to correlate the two. And each time you look at it, perhaps it actually reached a multiplier of 1 in the last decade of the 20th century. But look, in the Great Recession period, government spending increases have had no effect on growth whatsoever. What has had the biggest effect on growth? A change in the profitability of the private sector's capital, the blue block. The multiplier was 1.41 there, not so much there, but in all the other ones mostly, particularly in the 21st century, what has mattered is whether a country or a capitalist economy gets its profitability up. That changes its growth rate. And that's been I've done that a multiplier across a load of countries in order to show that government spending and fiscal spending doesn't achieve what it aims to achieve. Indeed, it could even do the opposite. So I'm going to finish, Chair, by just saying, I've gone on long enough, just to say, where are we now in the 21st century, in 2019? Well, here is the successful policy of Donald Trump and the trade war. We can see that global trade growth has now shown a sharp reduction in recent months into 2019. So this huge long expansion, the longest expansion in the history of capitalism, can we put that in big letters, is now, at least as far as trade is concerned, is coming to an end. And that's serious. If your own economy domestically is not doing very well, you're not investing much, production's not going forward, and your own people aren't spending enough because their wages are too low, then the best thing to do is to export, to take an advantage. But export is not becoming an option as the economy is slow and trade slows. And what's happening to manufacturing, which is the black line, is actually gone below 50. 50 is a measure of whether an economy is contracting or expanding. If it's above 50, it's expanding. I won't go into how you get that. It's a survey. It's not really accurate, but it's good enough to tell us what's going on. Actually, this is out of date. This black line, which is the manufacturing sector, is now below 48 as of today. We just had the figures today. So the key question is service sector, which is manufacturing is about 20% of most economies. It's not huge because we denuded manufacturing in the major economies. So services, which is everything else, which is a bit of an all-encompassing figure, is also declining. The latest figure, we just had the latest figure today, and it's on the 50, the services now. So that's coming down fast. So if you add them together, you get the light blue line. So that tells you we're basically, as of today, according on this measure, the whole economy, and this is global, not just one country, is more or less stagnant, and with the prospect of us going further down. So the third quarter of this year, which is from July to September, is clearly going to be at least flat for the major economies, and the final quarter of this year is likely to be negative. So maybe the long expansion is coming to an end. This is a measure of global investment by the businesses, and just look at the dark blue line. You can see that it's heading down into negative territory. You can see that it's ups and downs, ups and downs. So we had two periods when it was negative before. This is the Euro crisis, and then in 2016 we had what I call a mini recession, but it's recovered thanks to a bit of expansion and keeping the things going, but now it's coming back down again. And that's my measure of global profits, which you may be surprised to hear that a Marxist economist wanted to look at global profits. So I looked at profits, and where is profits now? That's a bit out of date again because it's only up to the end of the year, but you can see it's completely flat at best. There is no, on the overall, taking into account these are all the 6 or 7 major economies, taking all their figures, overall, the corporate sector of the major economies is not making any profits overall. Yes, I know Microsoft's making profits. I know Amazon's making profits. But Thomas Cook is not making profits. It's a question of an average. And so you get that combination, and that's where the position is. All those zombie firms and everybody are in that figure. And we now have a flat economy. So we're now entering a period, in my view, Chair, where the long expansion since the Great Recession of 2007-8 is over. It's been weak, it's been poor, it's been really stagnation, and now we're heading it into that next recession, regular and recurring recession, due primarily to the underlying process of profitability in the major sectors of the capitalist economies, which of course has an effect on finance, on debt, and all the other things that we've got. And this time, as we go into 2020s, into this third decade, there are so many other major challenges that we know faces global capitalism, but they haven't considered before. So another global slump is coming. But let me just say 3 things, Chair, that are coming. Climate change and global warming is now an issue which capitalism is unable to cope with, and yet it's entering a new global recession. And yet we've been told by the scientists that the rate of expansion of carbon emissions and the speeding up of temperature is such that we are running out of time before this becomes irreversible and will have significant and lasting damage for millions, if not billions, of people around the world, particularly poor people. Second one is there is no stop on the rising inequality of income and wealth around the world. We see in the major economies, we have never had such an unequal set of economies. The very, very uber rich are way, way behind and ahead of the rest of us, not only in income, but particularly in wealth, what they own in terms of finance and homes and so on. And most of that, we can't even find out what they're doing with it because they're salting it away in tax havens and nothing is done about it. And that situation is getting worse and worse. Now, I've heard also, there's lots of arguments, which I deal with on my blog, by the way, that yes, well, there's inequality in the big economies, but actually the world is getting more equal. The poor countries are catching up with the rich ones overall on average. Well, you only have to, if you look at the data, it's true. If you look at the World Bank's figures, they say everybody who earns more than, anybody who earns less than $1.90 a day is poor, in their opinion. Well, I can assure you that anybody who's earning less than $10 a day is pretty poor, but let's leave that aside for the moment. And that figure of those under $1.90 a day is falling dramatically. Why? What's going on? The answer is that there is one country in the world that has made a dramatic improvement in its levels of income and standards of living. It has taken 800 million people out of $1.90 a day under and up, and that's China. And we have to consider the question of whether China is an example of a fantastically successful capitalist economy in the last 50 years, which runs against everything that's happened in everywhere else, or there's something different about China that we have to consider. That's a question I often pose to other Marxist economists because I'm in a minority on this one, and amongst the left in general, who are totally and utterly convinced that China is just like another capitalist economy and no different. Well, if it's no different, how can we explain this? There's something else, it seems to me, going on. So the poverty is only being reduced because of one particular factor between countries, and inequality within each country is not being reduced at all. And finally, again, I've said that 5 times, there is the other issue of whether we'll all have a job. Well, I don't need one now, but in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, as capitalism looks for a way out of this by using robots, automation, and other ways to wipe out what some people estimate as possibly up to half the existing jobs that people have at the moment. Maybe they'll be replaced by new jobs, because that's what often technology does. It creates new industries with new jobs. It's not a black and white question, as Marx explains as well. It's a dialectical question. There's 2 processes going on. But it is a serious question, because even if people get new jobs, the transition from people who have lost their jobs won't be the same people who get the new jobs. And those people transitioning to new jobs need training, they need some to hold them up while that's happening, and yet there's no possibility that capitalism can provide that. Chair, one of the areas of jobs that is going to be lost is professional economists. They will definitely disappear in the process of automation and robots. I can give you 2 examples of that. The first is that I used to go to lots of meetings with clients who are bankers and hedge funds, because that's what it did. I was in the heart of the mammon, and across the table like this, they would be asking me, do you think the dollar's going up or not? That's the sort of question I was asked. And so they would say, I would say, well, and then they would come back and say, well, we've decided that we're going to short the dollar. Oh yes, did you have a meeting about it? Yes, we had a meeting. What happened? There's 6 people. So 6 people had a meeting. How did you decide? Well, it was 3 of us thought the dollar was going up, and 3 of us thought the dollar was going down. So we asked the algorithm, and the algorithm voted for going down. So this company, I'm telling you, had an algorithm that had just as much a vote as the owners of the company, because they saw that as a process. And the other one, Chair, is they had a competition once, the Financial Times, to give them some information, to write an economics report for a company about, I don't know, Turkey or something. And they were given the information. So lots of people wrote the article, and the winner of the report was a robot. They had all the information, wrote it all up, perfect English, you couldn't tell it was a robot, and it won. So you see, there's no future for people like me under the next 20 or 30 years of capitalism. But unfortunately for all of us, there's a real danger there's no future for any of us unless we can do something about changing this system.
Well, thank you very, very much, Michael. That was great. happy to take some questions.
Yeah, of course, yeah. After that length, you better give me some questions. Yeah.
Any questions about the
Should we take two opinions? You and you. Just two. So another one. Start with those if you're happy with that.
Your starting point was quite entertaining about what we have to say about
Cool. It was great. Really good. Take the gear